Okay, so welcome everyone. So I'd like to welcome everyone to this particular lunch chat, which is entitled What Medical Students Should Know About Invention and Intellectual Property, a conversation with Dr. Gary Michelson. And so now I would like to introduce Dr. Gary Michelson. So Dr. Gary Michelson is a retired orthopedic spinal surgeon, medical inventor, and billionaire philanthropist. One of the most prolific inventors in the history of medicine, Dr. Michelson is the sole name inventor on more than 950 patents worldwide, and his innovations have revolutionized spinal surgery. So join us for a conversation moderated by patent attorney Mr. David Dykeman of Greenberg Traurig Global Life Sciences and Medical Technology Group. So now I would like Dr. Michelson, if you would like to say a few words.
Well, first of all, good morning and welcome. It's nice to see everybody. So as I was telling Jordan, I was thinking of wearing a t-shirt today instead of a white shirt, just to remind me to keep this casual. I'm really just here to answer your questions. It's not going to be a lecture. Okay, Jordan.
Definitely. Mr. Dykeman, I know we had discussed earlier about a couple questions that we may wanted to talk about to get the conversation going, if you'd like to ask a few of those.
Sure. Thank you for having me, Jordan, and thanks for planning such an important conference for the medical students, and we're excited to have many of you here. And I think for the first question, we're going to go to Dr. Michelson back when he was a student at Temple University, attending medical school at Drexel in Philadelphia. Did you ever imagine that flash forward 45 years, you'd be giving a lecture on innovation to medical students?
No, that was an easy question. No.
There you go. But tell us what you were thinking when you were in medical school. You know, what back then it was a different time, and medical innovation and patenting wasn't really on the radar. But tell us, what did you see your career evolving when you were still a med student, like many of the audience?
Well, my path was, I think, a bit unusual. Most people go into medical school clearly because they want to be a physician, but they're really not sure what kind of physician or where they're headed. And I think one of the great things about medicine is it really is so vast that everybody can sort of find their isoelectric point. I mean, clearly the personality of a radiologist is much different than the personality of an anesthesiologist, which is certainly much different than the personality of a pathologist. So I think that along those 4 years, everybody sort of does find out where they belong in this vast field of medicine. But I was different. I actually went into medical school with the desire to be a spine surgeon. So my path was quite different.
And we know a little bit of your family history led you to becoming a spinal surgeon, but can you tell us how you knew you had that focus before you went into medical school?
Well, there's a joke where there is a debate about when life begins after conception. And I can tell you that if you're Jewish, your grandparents will tell you that life begins when you graduate from medical school. That's when a fetus becomes a human being.
Well, you've matured nicely. And what was it like for you when you were attending medical school at Drexel?
Again, my life was very different. I left home when I was 17. I had to work and put myself through college. Luckily for me at that time, Temple University really had an incredibly inexpensive fee structure. It could have been $15 a credit back then. So I could afford to find a place to live, to eat, and put myself through college. I don't think people can too easily do that today. So I was busy trying to just provide for myself food and shelter and to attend classes. I do remember, however, though, and it did affect my life, I could not afford to purchase textbooks. And so I would go to the library after I got out of school to use, they used to have 3 copies of every book that they used there, but by the 3rd or 4th week, they'd been stolen. So then there were no books. And I remember how difficult that was. And later in my life, and actually in 2008, that started me on this path of 20 million minds, the purpose of which was I had decided to become a college textbook publisher, but instead of selling the books, give them away for free. And that ended up driving our relationships with the Hewlett Foundation and funding Rice University's OpenStax project, which now has about 46 college textbooks that are of superior quality that are open license, freely downloadable. And that's really saved students billions of dollars thus far. So that's the antecedent of those efforts later in my life.
And so innovation and invention has also been a part of your life. Can you tell the story of how you came up with your first invention and filed your first patent application?
Yes, I did a fellowship in spine surgery. And interestingly enough, it wasn't that difficult to get a fellowship in those days because nobody wanted to be a spine surgeon. And there was a good reason for that, because you would do the operations exactly the way you're supposed to do them. You could do them with a high level of skill, and some number of the patients got better, some didn't get better, and some got worse. So that really wasn't an appetizing path for most physicians. And when I was doing my fellowship, I was with one of the probably most famous spine surgeons in the world at the time, and I saw a problem. I was taking out a disc from a woman, and we removed the soft tissue that was pressing on the nerve, and what was left behind was what looked like a rhinoceros horn of hard bone that was pinching into the nerve root. And I said to this doctor, his name was Brodsky, I said, Alex, what are we going to do about that? And he literally took my hand out of the wound and said, we're going to do nothing about that. We're going to close the patient back up. This one just won't get better. That was, didn't make any sense to me. And he told me that he personally had tried to bite the piece of bone out using what was called a rongeur. And the end of the rongeur had exploded because the bone was harder than the little pin in the hinge of the jaw of the instrument. And he had to then sew up the dural sac, which was leaking, fish out the piece of metal. And he said, what I learned from that was to never do that again. In the meantime, the man who probably was one of the most famous spine surgeons in the world had been doing a televised surgery on a very difficult case where he stuck a burr down into the spine to try to grind that little horn of bone off, and actually wound up this young woman's spinal cord and paralyzed her. This is on a televised broadcast. So Alex said to me, you're going to do nothing about that. So several years later, when I was in my own practice, I saw the exact same thing. I said to myself, I'm not leaving that. I'm certainly not going to put a rongeur and bite it. I'm not going to stick in a grinder and try to grind it, but I'm not leaving that. So I thought about it. And the anatomy of the vertebrae is like a piece of good rye bread. The outside's a hard crust, but inside is the softer stuff, what we call the cancellous bone. So it sort of made sense to me that I could get a small instrument, what we call an impactor, and drive this spur down into the softer bone so nothing would get hurt. I'd have to protect the nerve, protect the dural sac, have a clean view, and drive this thing down. And then I'd be able to pick it up after it was broken off and take it out. So I did that. I protected the dural sac, which has the nerve roots in it, and the nerve root itself. And I found an impactor from a hip surgery set. And I tapped it and nothing happened. And I tapped it again and nothing happened. And there's an old saying in orthopedic surgery, if at first you don't succeed, just go and get a bigger hammer. So true to my training, I did. And I hit this thing, and I heard, and I felt my hand go down, took out the instrument, and I'm wearing what are basically telescopes, magnifying lenses. And I'm looking around, and two things struck me. First of all, I couldn't find the piece. And second of all, even though I knew I'd just broken bone, there wasn't a drop of blood. So something strange was going on. I had to like try to figure out what this was. And what had happened was the piece of hard bone had gone down into the soft bone and basically acted like a cork on a wine bottle. It was self-sealing. So now the floor was as smooth as could be, no blood. I went, this is really cool. So having done that one time, I sat down and actually designed a set of instruments that were properly sized, properly shaped, properly configured to work in the spinal canal. And I had a set of those made. Now, I was a fellowship trained spine surgeon. Most people in those days who did spine surgery were not. They happened to be an orthopedic surgeon, or they happened to be a neurosurgeon. And so I started getting referrals, this was early in my practice, from other doctors who casually did spine surgery, who operated on patients that didn't get better. At that point, the thing is, let's punt. You know, I don't want the liability of this. Let me send this guy somewhere else, let him deal with that. But they always wanted to come to surgery and watch. So when I started using these instruments, the very first response was, where did you get those? And I said, well, I had them made. So they would say, well, make me a set. I had so many of those make me a sets that the machinist who was making it for me one day said, listen, this is like setting up type to print business cards. All the work is in setting up the machines. Why don't you make 100 of them? He said, you can have 100 made for the same cost of doing 3 all by themselves. So I've said to myself, what am I going to do with 100 sets of these impaction instruments? So I went into business. And that's what started me with inventing things to solve problems, into offering them to other people, so that not only started my inventing, it actually started a business, which was later sold to Johnson & Johnson.
So, and when did you decide to try to patent your invention, your first invention?
Well, the reality is that intellectual property is the sine qua non, that without which you cannot market anything, because no manufacturer, no medical device manufacturer is going to have any interest in making your devices and bringing them to market if they can't recover their costs of doing the so-called development, to do the setup for manufacturing, to manufacture them, to hold inventory. So unless you have some proprietary rights to it, it'll never see the marketplace. Now, in my case, I could do it myself. But when you start to talk about companies like Johnson & Johnson or Medtronic, no, they want intellectual property to have proprietary rights to develop that product.
So, and when you wrote your first patent or were involved as an inventor, did you enjoy the process of writing a patent and working with a patent attorney?
I did. And actually, I took a different approach to it. If anybody picks up one of my patents and reads it, they're a little bit unusual. So since the patent attorney didn't actually draft the language, I did. And then they did whatever they wanted to do with that, whether it was numbering drawings, which later on I started doing myself anyway. I always thought it was best to sort of say, what did the world used to look like? In other words, how do we get to where we are now? And what is the status quo? And then how is this an improvement upon, or how does it solve some problem which was still left existent? So mine's actually a little education. Maybe it's because of how I learned. But so what was the history of the world? What's the present state of the art? How does this make an improvement?
And you mentioned, that you got your start by selling your instruments and creating a business. You had no formal business training, right, in medical school or before.
No, you'll love this, David. I had a dog walker because I had two Doberman Pinschers and I was at work all day. So I hired this young woman who used to run my two dogs. And she said to me, if you have any other work, I could use the money. I said, sure. Why don't you run my medical company? So after 2 years, I know this sounds crazy, we had $3 million of sales. And this was 1985. $3 million of sales after 2 years in 1985 with my dog walker. She was the whole company.
So once sales started wrapping up, how did you balance a busy surgical practice and the business and inventing?
Well, now you're at the heart of the biggest question in life. So when I was sitting here thinking about what would I have liked to have heard when I was in the same position that these people are in right now, it would be the answer to your question. Scott Peck, who wrote that book, The Road Less Traveled, said we give our time to that which we love. At the end of the day, we each only have so much life energy and we each only have so many hours in the day. And probably the toughest decision that everybody on this Zoom is going to have to make is how they intend to spend their hours. And I can tell you this, if you look ahead and say, what would you like to see on your tombstone? That may inform your decision. If you want to see on your tombstone, great father, great husband, then you better plan on spending more time at home. If you want to see change the world, you better plan on spending some more time at work. And that's going to be the toughest decision because you can't have it both ways. And the very fact that these people are on this call, this Zoom, tells you some very important information. First, God gifted them with intelligence, and they should never take credit for that. That was a gift. But what they do get to take credit for is the hard work that they did to rise above other people to have earned these positions, to have this opportunity. And that shows you the third quality, which is perseverance. And if you want to talk about inventing, there are 5 things that you need to be a real inventor, to be a serial inventor, not an accidental observer of an event, which may allow you to be an inventor. And those are, you need to be intelligent, you need to be knowledgeable, and you absolutely need to have perseverance. And the other 2 qualities you need to have are imagination, and you have to have courage. All purposeful, directed inventing involves coloring outside the lines, thinking outside the box, the willingness to do what your parents told you to never do, which is take stuff apart, deconstruct it, because that's disrespectful. But you have to do it. And you have to do it without the certain knowledge that you can put it back together again. My brother, who's lost a lot of watches because I took them apart, will tell you that. There's no guarantee you're going to put them back together. So the best thing I could impart to you right now is, as you start on your journey, think about what you want to do with your time. And you all have a competitive bent. You didn't get here by not being competitive. Okay, so you all have that. You all have the willingness to work hard. And the question is, do you want to temper that competitive drive to be a good husband, to be a good wife, to be a good father? David, you know this, it's a conflict, right?
There's only so many hours in the day. That's the number one challenge. But I think along those lines, when did you have kind of your eureka moment that, this business might, equal or at some point eclipse your medical practice?
Never had that, never had any interest. I know this sounds crazy, but really was never driven by making money. In 1993, I entered into an agreement that was worth, I don't know, 20 or 30 million dollars. Now, most people probably would have retired. I never even saw the money. As I tell people, it was like a transfer of electrons from somebody else's bank account to my bank account. It wasn't like somebody drove up with a truck and started unloading $100 bills. Not one single thing in my life changed. I still got up at 5:30 in the morning. I still meditated. I still went to the hospital, made rounds. It was like it never happened. And it's the famous line that Warren Buffett said. He said, if I wasn't getting paid to go to work every day, I'd have to figure out who to pay to let me. You know, when you're doing what Buddha called right work, when you're doing what makes you happy, that's why you do it. So for me, it was never about the money. Now, I was competitive, don't get me wrong, and I was driven, but it wasn't the money.
Well, I mean, clearly you're driven by helping patients, and your instruments have helped, millions and millions of patients live a better life and walk better, function better. What's an inspiring story of a patient that got back to you with how you changed their life?
Well, I can tell you a great story. I was standing in line at a movie theater, and a woman comes up, puts her arms around me, and says to the guy standing next to her, I assume it's her husband, "This is that wonderful Dr. Michelson." And she's hugging me, and I feel the tears rolling down the side of my face. And I'm saying to myself, this is going to be embarrassing because I don't know who this woman is. Now, that's not a good moment. And this went on for a couple of minutes, and as she finally sort of let go of me and backed off, I saw a little tiny scar here and one here, which, in case somebody doesn't know, they're the holes that are left when you put a halo on somebody. They're the pinholes. And a halo is a steel hoop that you put around somebody's head that goes to 4 steel pillars that go to a vest that holds somebody's neck in place who has a broken neck, but you can't operate on them because they're probably in such bad shape they can't undergo surgery. So this is how you stabilize them externally because you can't open them up to stabilize them internally. And I recognized who this woman was. So this was a woman who had come into the emergency room, who was not wearing a seatbelt when her husband, who was driving the car, who was wearing a seatbelt, collided with a tree. And she had actually gone through the windshield and hit the tree. So they brought her in with severe brain injury, any number of other terrible injuries, and a broken neck. So I had put her in a halo vest, and when I would see her, I have to make rounds in the morning. So you need some place to sit down and write on your charts. So she went into neuro rehab eventually. And I don't want to say she was in a coma because she wasn't. She wasn't ventilated. She just was non-responsive, I guess would be the right word to put it. And all I can say is her head looked like a pumpkin. It was huge, it was round. You could see some eyes. You could hardly see the features on her because of the massive swelling of all her face bones. And you need a place to sit when you write on the chart. So in every patient room, there were private rooms, there was a small desk area. So rather than sit at the nurse's station, I would sit there and I would talk to her. She never talked back, but eventually she was moved to sort of a chronic rehab center. This was that woman. Not only did she survive, I stopped seeing her after we took off the halo vest, which was around, I think, 10 weeks, but she became a normal person again. They rehabbed her. She got back her memory. She could walk and talk, and that's who it was.
So we've got the first question from our audience in the chat. So please feel free to put in any questions. Dr. Michelson really wants this to be an interactive session, but it's a great question. Can you kind of give an overview of your 950 patents? You've been such a prolific inventor. What type of kind of spinal instruments and surgical methods have you been able to patent?
Okay, so the first important thing is I went into a field where the technology really was not good. And that made it very fertile ground for inventing. Had I gone into some other area, potentially I would not have been an inventor. But here, what I saw was I was starting out, and there were people who were giants in my field, and I would see a problem. I would call them up, which you can do when you're a student. You know, once you're supposed to know it all, you can't call anybody anymore. But when you're starting out, you can call these people up and you go, look, I just saw this problem and I don't know what to do. And they go, well, yeah, we don't know how to do either. You go, really? So you're not the only one seeing the problem, but they're all accepting it the way it is. And George Bernard Shaw said that inventors are a disgruntled lot. He said the rest of us see the world the way it is, and we adapt ourselves to the world. He said, but inventors want to change the world to adapt it to themselves. So when I saw a problem, I saw it just as what it was, a problem to be solved. Whereas everybody else was willing to accept it as it was, I wasn't. And I think that's what drove the inventive process for me. And then inventing is a skill set, just like any other learnable skill set. It requires a constellation of qualities, but I think that almost anyone could be an inventor. And by way of example, and David is certainly aware of these, there's all kinds of different inventing. But if there's something that's common to all of them, it's the ability to see with meaning. And what do I mean by that? Well, in 1938, there was a 27-year-old engineer who had just been hired by DuPont. And he was studying alternative gases to use for refrigerants. And he ordered up a batch of polytetraethylene, which is a common carbon source when you want to manufacture other things. And he wasn't ready to use it, so he had it compressed into a cylinder and stuck it into a freezer. And his name was Roy Plunkett. And when it came time to use it, he took it out, he let it thaw out, he opened the valve and nothing came out. So he shook it, but nothing came out. So he sent it down to the machine shop and had him cut the cylinder open. And what slid out was this white, waxy, massive goop. And it slid out so cleanly, there was nothing left on the walls. Well, what that was a process called cold polymerization, which nobody had ever observed before. And what he had created was polytetrafluoroethylene, which is Teflon. But what he had the smarts to appreciate what it was he was seeing. Think about all the products we have nowadays, from Gore-Tex to Teflon, everything. So he invented it by accident, but he had the smarts to be able to see it and understand what it was. So sometimes things just happen by accident, and you're a witness. The question is, can you see the meaning in that extraordinary event? So the rubber that we're familiar with, like goes in the car tires, is a polymerized product from the rubber sap. That occurred when sulfuric acid was accidentally spilled onto the gummy substrate. But the person who did that had the smarts to see what had happened. Now, sometimes inventing is nothing more than seeing the extraordinary in the very ordinary. So every single person who's ever walked through the woods has had a cockleburr stick to their clothes. But one man came home, took out a magnifying glass, and he goes, "Why are these things stuck to my sweater?" And that's how Velcro was invented. He saw what was extraordinary in what was the very ordinary. So there's all kinds of different inventive processes. It probably wasn't even the question you asked me, but go ahead, David.
It's a good answer to any question, but I think so. You've got 950 patents, and I've worked with a lot of inventors, and they say it's like their children. They love them all the same. But you must have, what's your favorite patent? Which invention really got you the most excited?
No, it's always the last one. So once you've already invented it, those children are off to college. You're done with those. Other people might be excited, but that doesn't excite you anymore. Land, the gentleman who invented the Polaroid process, he was the same way. Whatever he had just invented no longer interested him. That was a mystery that was solved. And what you're on to is the next one. They're all like puzzles. They all have solutions. And what's interesting is, as he observed, in the end, the solution is always elegantly simple. That's how you know you've gotten to the right answer. It's always simple. And in fact, other people look at you and go, "That's not an invention. That's so simple." Really? It's simple after you see it.
Right. Hindsight makes everything obvious, right? Isn't that the way?
Correct. 2020.
So you, when you were in med school, I don't know if you envisioned ever creating a patent, but, patents have become the currency in medical devices and in biotechnology. Do you think med students who are on the call today or medical schools should be teaching more about innovation and IP?
Absolutely. So we take it for granted now. If you are in the hospital and somebody puts in an IV, you'll see them slap down a little 2x2 piece of, it's really steri drape. It's just some plastic that's got an adhesive on it that holds everything in place. Well, that seems like a no invention, except that before some nurse invented that, they were there with rolls of tape and they were doing this and doing that and all kinds of crazy stuff. And this little 2x2 piece of steri drape basically works better than everything and saves everybody a lot of time. So that was an invention. Let me give you a great invention. When I was a boy and you bought a loaf of white bread, it came in a plastic bag, but they had a wire that they twisted around the end of the bag to keep it closed. Well, first of all, you couldn't even tell which way it was twisted. So each time you went to do it, you had to twist it one way or twist it the other way. And if you did it a couple times, the wire broke anyway. Somebody came up with the idea of just a little plastic tab that has a funnel-like opening and then a hole. You pop it on, it holds the bag closed. But even better, it gave you room for what they call indicia. You can write on there 69 cents or the name of the bread or whatever. That's a great invention. It couldn't be more simple, but it does exactly what you want it to do. And it does it better than what the prior art was. So every one of these people in this call can certainly be an inventor. They have all the right qualities.
One of the amazing things you've done, Dr. Michelson, is with your philanthropic endeavors, which are very numerous, but you've also created an incredible resource for intellectual property to teach medical students, and anyone. And I think I encourage all the students to visit michelsonip.com, sign up for the newsletter. If you have no experience in intellectual property, it's just every newsletter provides insights into it and helps you think like an inventor and capitalize on your innovations. So we're in the middle of a pandemic, Dr. Michelson. But before we get to that, how innovation can help COVID, what made you decide to create that website and create this resource of IP for the masses?
So, Bill Clinton had entered the White House with a budgetary deficit. And when he left, they were running at a surplus. Several years after he was out of the White House, somebody asked him a question about that. And he said, I should not get the credit for that. He said, the credit goes to personal computers. So personal computers expanded the economy. They grew the GDP. We're facing the greatest budget deficit of all time, historic proportions. We're never going to tax the American people sufficiently to deal with even the interest on that. The only real answer is for the economy to grow. I remember when I was a boy, you would listen to what was going on in Congress and they'd be talking about millions or tens of millions or hundreds of millions. And then later people were talking about billions. And now we're talking about trillions. There wasn't $1 trillion in the entire world when I was a boy. So we need to grow the economy. And I don't know what the next personal computer will be, but to give you an example, again, when I was a boy, you could go to any law firm, and David will know this, and they had what was called a secretary pool. Very sexist, all women, and they were all typing away. And all the parties to any agreement would need an original, which meant they were typing the same document over and over and over again, or 28 different people were typing the same document. What changed was word processors. A word processor allowed you to change a word, a sentence, and there was nothing to retype. And the printer put out as many originals as you wanted. So suddenly one person with a word processor was as good as 28 people with typewriters. Now, the real question would be then, well, what happened to those other 27 people? Weren't they out of work? Well, you might think so, but no. So what had happened was the productivity of that one person had expanded 30-fold. And these other people could be similarly trained or trained to do other things that made use of the same technology. And actually, if you go back and look, unemployment was at a historic low despite this expansion of productivity. And that's the only thing that will save this country. That's the only way you'll get out of these deficits. And so that lies within each of us. So there's an old saying about inside of each person's a great American novel waiting to get out. I don't know about that. But believe me, every one of you will see things in your lives and say to yourself, wait a second, if I'm struggling, then other people are struggling. This is a solvable problem. When you solve that problem, the world gets better, productivity goes up, you get richer, even though that's not your goal. But I mean, this is what we need to do. We need to have everybody be inventors.
It's a great point, Dr. Michelson. And you mentioned, practicing invention, that it's a skill that you can learn. But clearly now, looking back, you've had so many successes, but tell us about a failed invention and how that led to a greater success down the road.
Okay, well, I worked in a very strange area because some of my inventions never saw the light of day. And they didn't fail to see the light of day because they didn't deserve to. They failed to see the light of day because of circumstance. So for example, the FDA in its infinite wisdom labeled any product that had as a component something that they classified as medicinal into a category where you could not possibly get it approved. It was at the minimum a 10-year regulatory process. The costs were so prohibitive, nobody would do it. So several of my inventions fell into that category, and they really would have been boons to medical practice. They would have helped doctors, they would have helped patients, never saw the light of day. The next problem has to do with if you're a medical device manufacturer, and I bring you something completely done, there's no development. It's perfect just the way you receive it, which is unusual. I actually employed a full-time machinist and 2 patent attorneys who did nothing but work for me. When I brought a product to a manufacturer, it was complete. There was nothing for them to do. They couldn't make it better. Call it, I don't know, pride, whatever. If you walk into my house, people accused me. They said, your house looks like a museum. Everything's just exactly in place. Everything's clean. Well, I guess I'm an anal compulsive guy, which isn't a bad quality for a spine surgeon, by the way. It's not good for a husband, but it's not bad for a spine surgeon. But I guess I didn't like the idea that I would take something to somebody and somehow they could make it better. Because to me, that would mean I didn't do my best work. But after I did that, for them to do what are called the machine drawings, so that they can send them to their factory to then have them drive these computer numeric machines, these CNC machines, to make these things, to actually make these things, to get what's called GMP, good manufacturing practices, which they submit to the FDA for approval, to get regulatory approval, to build inventory, to train their people to sell it and then take it to market. No matter what, it's a several years process. So what if they start down the road on one of these things, and a year later I come to them and I say, listen, you want to see something's better than what the last thing I showed you was? The answer is no. No, we really don't want to see something better. We want to get this to market and recover our cost. And so that's the problem. Unless you want to start distributing your inventions to a host of manufacturers, which will not make you friends, some of your products aren't going to get made.
So, Dr. Michelson, if I may ask a question here, we have some stacking up in the chat, and I would like to point us to them. So, one of our attendees asked, from your first dog walker employee and your first invention, how did you build a sustainable company and grow your investments?
Okay, so this is a very interesting circumstance. Johnson & Johnson happened to own Codman Shirtleff, which at the time was the largest seller of spinal devices, actually intracranial devices too, in the world. So they were making all the brain shunts and all the spine instruments and the rongeurs and everything else. And the gentleman that ran that company's name was Roy Black. And chances are none of you have been to these things, but they used to have these meetings like the meeting of the American Society of Neurosurgeons or the American Academy of Orthopedic Surgeons. And they would have them in a place like Las Vegas. And these big companies, Zimmer and Richards and Johnson & Johnson, would literally build 3-story high structures inside of the convention hall to show their products and have lecture hall. I mean, it's crazy. So Roy Black was there for Johnson & Johnson, had one of these massive Taj Mahal kind of things. And as he looked out, there were no doctors. So during these meetings, you want the doctors to come and look at your product. No doctors. And as he looked out from the 3rd story of this thing, he saw just this herd of doctors standing around a table, just a table. So he came downstairs and he went over and he got in line and he worked his way to the table and he started picking up these things, which are the things that we manufactured. He went back to work the next day and called me. And he told me the story. He said, here we were with this structure. It must have cost us $1 million to build and take around. Here you are with a booth and all the doctors are at your booth. He goes, we need to talk. So Johnson & Johnson then said, we'd like to buy out all of your products. And that's how this started. So it sounded to me, and it's an answer to David's question, you only have so much time in the day. Yes, I could sell these products and make an 80% markup, or I could give them to Johnson & Johnson to sell and only make a 10% markup. So the question is, can they sell 8 times more than I could? And isn't it worth it for me not to have my time in this? And the answer was yes and yes. So that's when I decided I'm never going to sell stuff. I'll just license it to the people most capable of manufacturing and selling it. And at the end of the day, in retrospect, I actually provided technology to 18 different companies. 15 of them were huge, and 3 were startups that had no other product than my product that they built an entire company around. A company called Spine Tech got licensing rights to one of my inner body implants called a threaded cage, and sold the company for $600 million 5 years later. That was their only product.
So Dr. Michelson, what's the lessons you learned from business that you wish you learned in medical school and can tell these students today?
Well, it's not that. It's that, first of all, I never took a business course. I'm not a business person, so I really would like to disown that. I think that, and you know this, David, as you go through life, you learn things. So one of the things I learned, for example, is if you were to have an invention today and go to one of the medical device manufacturers, that would be asymmetrical warfare. You would stand no chance of holding your own. They'll say to you, look, we're the largest seller of medical device in the world. You're lucky if we even pick up your device. Do you have any idea how much it costs us to set up the machining to do it, to carry the inventory, blah, blah, blah. We'll do a great job. We'll pay you a 5% royalty. You go, oh, okay. The truth is that they'll do whatever they want to do. And that may be to get the exclusive rights to your technology and never make any. And they'll go, yeah, well, that was a business decision. You see this all the time, David, if you read the rags about the intellectual property lawsuits where these companies are ripping off inventors. They enter into these agreements, they make nothing. And the inventors are disgruntled, they want their stuff back, and the company goes, no. So one of the things, for example, that I learned is it's jujitsu. You say to the company, okay, well, listen, if I let you have this technology, how many dollars in sales are you going to make? Now, here's where they lie in the other direction. They go, well, we'll send $10 million. They want you to say yes, and now they're all about how great a job they're going to do. And then you say, so let me see if I understand this. You want me to believe that if I entrust my technology to you, that next year you're going to sell $10 million worth of my product? They go, yeah. And then you're going to pay me a 10% royalty. I'll tell you what, why don't we do this? Why don't you just guarantee me $1 million in royalties per year, and then you sell as much as you want? So you have to take what they're telling you and turn it around so it works for you against them. Now they're in the position where they're going to say, no, we're not really going to sell 10 million. And then here's the interesting part. They'll sign that agreement, and what they'll do is they'll say to their sales force, forget everything else. This is what you need to sell, because they don't want egg on their face. So they will sell 10 million, but they wouldn't have otherwise. So as you go through life, you learn these things. You can't learn that in medical school. You learn it because you do one contract, you do another contract, you do another contract. But I can tell you this, there's no substitute for integrity. And that's your own, and it's trying to find that in the other people that you're dealing with in business. So you're a constant. The guy who's the president of the company over there may not be the president in 10 years, but you hope he is. You don't want to deal with the person's in charge of new business. You don't want to deal with the guy who's the head of engineering. You want to talk to the president of the company, and you want a relationship with that person. And if you meet with that person, you don't have a good feeling, leave. So, for example, in this agreement that I had with Roy Black, things came up. Roy never said to me, well, the contract says, or when something came out in the other direction, I never went to my drawer and pulled out the contract. I'd say, Roy, what do you think we should do? And interestingly enough, this massive lawsuit that I was in with Medtronic actually came about because in 1993, I entered into a pair of agreements with a gentleman named Ron Pickard, who was running a company called Sophomore Danek. Sophomore Danek replaced Codman Shirtleff as the #1 purveyor of spinal hardware because it was selling implants when Johnson & Johnson decided that was too risky. So by selling spinal implants, Sophomore Danek became the leading seller of spinal hardware in the world. And Ron Pickard ran that company. And until Medtronic bought them out in 2001, I think Ron and I were like best friends. And not one time was there ever a word of conflict. Something would come up. I'd say, Ron, do whatever you think is right. And he'd go, no, 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 no. Let's do whatever you think is right. Because he knew that if it was him doing what was right, he would give me a better deal than I would give myself. And I knew in reverse the same. That's the kind of relationships you want to have. You don't want to have a stack of lawyers and contracts. So having integrity yourself, having a good feeling about the integrity of the people you're going to interact with, try to find the person who's going to be most stable, who's probably the president of the company, not the guy in engineering. Those are the words of advice I would give you, but I could not have known those in medical school.
Those are great words of wisdom, Dr. Michelson. And something else that's evident is you have an innovation mindset. You see a problem and you need to solve it, and you're always looking for the next solution. But how do you deal with colleagues, whether they're renowned surgeons or younger students who either want to keep the status quo or might have some doubts about your innovations?
Okay, so I assume everybody on this Zoom has heard the old tripe about if you build a better mousetrap, the world will beat a path to your door. Has everybody heard that? That's crap. That's crap. Listen, the world is heavily invested in the way the world is right now. And David and I could probably sit here and regale you with stories. So Kodak, at one point in time, had 90% of the world's camera business. 90% of the world's camera business and 100% of the film business. Digital photography was invented at Kodak. They killed it. They had zero interest in it. They thought it would be bad for their film business and they thought it would be bad for their camera business. They almost went out of business when digital photography went elsewhere. This story repeats itself over and over again. There's a book actually about In Search of Excellence, but the point is that companies are very reluctant to cannibalize themselves. They have something, it's successful. Do they really want to kill their core business and embrace something that's new? Rarely. So the answer to David's question is you should not expect people to go, hallelujah, hallelujah. No, they're going to try to preserve what they're doing right now. People don't like change. I can tell you a great story. Where I practiced spine surgery, one of the other doctors was truly world famous. He had written a textbook on approaches to the spine that everybody had to read. It was the Bible. So I'm in the doctor's lounge one day and I'm showing some doctors this thing I had invented. So his name was Bob Watkins. And I like Bob, but Bob, a little bit rigid. So Bob walks by and he looks at me, he goes, and walks away. I said, well, Bob, you might want to take a look at this. This is really cool. Solves a very difficult problem in spine surgery. And he turns around, I guess to embarrass me in front of these other people. And he goes, you know what? I'm a black belt in what I do and I'm new inventions out. So I'm not looking at any new inventions now. Well, the world passed him by. That new invention took over the world of spine surgery. But that's the mindset that you should expect to encounter. Not everybody's going to embrace change.
No, and I think you gave a great example. I'm located in Boston, and there used to be Polaroid's headquarters was here in Boston, right along the Charles River. That they went bankrupt, the headquarters closed, and now it's a biotech innovation center. So can you talk a little bit about how innovation can change healthcare and hopefully help us with COVID?
Absolutely. I can give you one very interesting example. I don't know how many smart watches are out there, but I can tell you that Apple knows before the Centers for Disease Control or the World Health Organization where epidemics are emerging. they collect the information on people's body temperature. And just like Waze or one of these other traffic programs can tell you where the traffic is the heaviest and the lightest, and they don't have helicopters up in the sky, they're just monitoring your devices. Apple knows before anybody knows where the world is getting sick. That's pretty interesting technology. And to turn around the other way, we now deliver healthcare electronically. And COVID has proven this as people have had their telehealth conferences at home. So technology does change everything. In terms of the research side of this, probably the greatest breakthrough of all times is big data. Big data, artificial intelligence, machine learning, just revolutionary. It's able to have you stick a fire hose of data and rather than being drowned, process that and find the real connections, find the relationships. No human being could do that. And this promise that we had 10 years ago of what they called individualized medicine or precision medicine, very few people got the idea that for you to have precision medicine, in other words, we run your genome, we see something, or maybe you have a tumor that has a particular marker. For that to have any meaning, any value whatsoever, we need 1 million other people's genomes to know what relationship that has to the whole. So in other words, maybe it's a breast cancer and it's what they call triple negative. So it's not driven by estrogen, it's not Herceptin. That tumor will not respond to cisplatin and 5-fluorouracil, the standard treatment for breast cancer. So that piece of information about what you have and whether to respond depends on the fact that 30,000 other women were given that treatment and none of them got better. So precision medicine depends on mass data. That's going to be the greatest change in all of medical research. I can tell you right now, mass data, deep machine learning.
So one of the questions we have, Dr. Michelson, is to talk about your medical school experience. But before we do that, we've got about 25 minutes left, and I know Dr. Michelson would love to hear directly from any medical students. So I'll ask this question. I have others, but going forward, we'd love to hear from the medical students. But one of the medical students asked, tell us about your experience in medical school. What were some of the challenges you faced? And did you ever imagine where your medical school career would take you?
All right, starting backwards, no, never imagined. And I can tell you the most interesting experience I had from medical school. I guess one of the most challenging moments of my life. So it was in my second year in medical school, and God, please tell me they don't do this anymore, but they had dog lab. And you would walk in and there would be these dogs on these metal tables. And they would say, okay, we're going to put these dogs to sleep and today we'll take out their left kidney. Now, when I walked in, I can actually still remember the dog. It tried to stand up and I said, sit, it sat down. And I said, lie down, and it lied down, and it started licking my hand. And this was somebody's pet. Somebody had simply stolen it out of their front yard, sold it to these people who pay money for the dogs because they want these dogs to operate one. And I was going to take out a normal kidney out of this healthy dog. It looked like it was probably 1 year or 2 years old. And by the way, next week it was take out a lung. Then it was take out half of the liver. And then they would do this every week, no pain medicines, until at the end they would kill the dog, but there was nothing left but a shell. And I said, I'm not doing this. And I walked out, and they had the dean called me in and he said, I better explain to you that no one in 150-year history of the blah, 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 has ever graduated who didn't do dog lab. He said, so you better think this through. You have 4 years of pre-med, you have 2 years of medical school, and now we're throwing you out. And he said, and by the way, we think there's something morally wrong with you. I said, really? He said, yeah. He said, you're not going to operate on a dog and then you're going to go operate on a human being? Who would do that? So here I was with the immense pressure of everything he had just said. Nobody had ever graduated medical school. I was morally degenerate because I thought I should operate on people, but not on dogs or whatever. And I knew I couldn't do it. I knew I could not do that. And I said, well, then you're going to have to throw me out of medical school. And I can only tell you that I only ran into one other person in my lifetime. His name is Neil Bernard, who runs the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine, who did the same thing, had the same life experience in the same time frame I did. And Neil has spent his entire adult life trying to stop medical schools from having dissections on living dogs and pigs. And I think we're down to just a few, so hopefully none of you went to a medical school where they did dog lab. It is the most horrible experience of my lifetime. Anyway, I ended up not being thrown out of medical school only by an accident. So what's the next question?
Luke, I saw you have a question for Dr. Michelson. Would you like to go off mute and ask it?
Sure, I can ask it. So, Dr. Michelson, I was curious if you've ever been approached by physicians in other specialties beyond spine surgery to collaborate for patents or inventions across fields, and if so, how did you handle that?
Yeah, I have. I'll tell you a funny story. So I was in trial with Medtronic, and Medtronic was trying to take everything I'd ever invented my whole life for their own without any compensation. That's really the heart of the lawsuit. But the guy was trying to make the point, the lawyer for the other side was trying to make the point I was a very, very difficult person. He said, doctor, it's true, isn't it, that you have hundreds and hundreds of patents? And I said, yeah, I guess so. And he said, it's true, isn't it, doctor, that you're the only named person on those patents? I said, yeah, that's true. He said, well, doctor, isn't that proof you're very difficult to work with others? Now, David, you should be smiling. That's the funny story.
Yeah.
So the answer is, somebody once said that a camel was actually a racehorse that was designed by a committee. So I guess I don't work well with others, or to say it differently, I don't derive benefit from that. I'm personally better off just working on my own. It's not that I don't like to work well with others. For me, it's usually inhibitory. And I can tell you my life experience is I've been in rooms where there's 20 or 30 engineers. And they're all bright people. You don't get to be an engineer and not be a bright person. But my life experience is that one very bright person with imagination and unrestrained from this idea of coloring inside the lines, thinking inside the box, is more productive than that entire room of engineers. At the end of the day, I don't care if you have a committee and something great came out, it came out of one person's mind. Now everybody else can add on, but those flashes of innovation, they come out of one mind. So usually I would say, no, that doesn't really interest me. Now, I would suggest to them what they might want to do, but I really wasn't looking to go find other people to work with.
No, and I think that's a great point, Dr. Michelson. I've been a patent attorney for almost 25 years, and I specialize in biomedical patents. I've worked with a lot of doctors. Some of them call themselves reform doctors and they don't practice anymore. Some are like you, where they love to practice and invent on the side. But I think the determination and the single-mindedness to pursue things is one of the key aspects of what makes an inventor an entrepreneur. And they're two different things. You can invent something and get a patent and hang the patent on your wall, but doing what you do, finding someone to actually license your patent, to pay for it, that's what makes an entrepreneur. And I think maybe you can talk about the skills that you think medical students need to succeed as an entrepreneur or even in the practice of medicine.
Okay, I'm gonna just spring off of one word that you said about single-mindedness. Everything has a cost. Every action has a consequence. So I just want to put this out here. If it takes 2,000 hours to read through the patents that I wrote, think about how many hours it took to actually invent these things, perfect them, and write out the patents that somebody else is now reading. That comes at a cost that I would not want any of my children to bear. So I did not have a television set. I did not have a wife. I did not have children. The words that come to mind are single-mindedness. Now, somebody would say driven. Driven doesn't even begin to really capture that level of narrow focus. And I'm saying this in a bad way. I want you to understand that the cost of being a me was extremely high. And for me, it was worth it. But it's not a path that other people should set upon. If I had a recommendation for most people, I would say balance. You have your work, you have your family, you have a dog, you go on picnics, you take vacations, you watch television. That would be a normal life. For other people, again, it comes to what you want on your tombstone. If what you want on your tombstone is, he changed the world, he made a difference, he left the world a better place than he found it, then you can go on my course. But each of you really has to make that decision for yourselves. That's the big decision.
Great answer. So we have another question from the audience. Malik, we'd love to hear from you. Would you mind coming off mute and asking your question directly to Dr. Michelson?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, so you spoke a little bit about your med school experience with the dog lab. I actually didn't even know that was a thing. And I was curious to know knowing what you know now, like all that you've been through, what would you tell your medical school self? I think us that we're in medical school now, we can learn a lot from the answer to your question, to that question.
What would I tell myself? Well, again, what I would tell all of my classmates would have been about balance, but that would not have worked for me. So, and that's just personal. I'm going to share something with you. It's very personal. I'm a father. Every time I walk past my son, I can't help but rub his head and tell him how much I love him. It was just a defect in my father. Every time he walked past me, he called me stupid. He goes, "Stupid, what are you doing? Stupid." And I've spent the rest of my life trying to compensate for that. So I don't need to go into psychiatry or be psychoanalyzed. I have no mystery about where this all comes from. But that's what drove me. So I ended up pursuing the life that worked for me. But it's not the one I would recommend for my children. It's not the one I would recommend for you. Now, if I had one piece of advice, very practical advice for everybody, it would be the first 2 years in medical school are memorizing a lot of crap that's useless. Now, I don't know who on this call knows what the Krebs cycle is. Does anybody know what the Krebs cycle is? Good. Tell us, Luke.
Oh, I hope you don't mean all the steps. But
Okay, but just tell us what it is. What's the purpose of the Krebs cycle?
The citric acid cycle, you make a a lot of ATP from NADH is used, and it's big for energy.
Yeah, it's oxidative phosphorylation. It's how you get to ATP, which drives everything that's biological. It's the energy source. Now, let me ask you a question. What's the sixth step of the Krebs cycle, Luke?
Is that alpha-ketoglutarate?
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
Perfect. You got it right. What's the 10th step?
Citrate dehydrogenase. I'm making it up at that point. I don't
Malate.
know.
Malate.
Malate.
Okay. What's the 8th step?
I'm going to tag someone else in here. Jordan, what do we got? Nothing?
Succinate. Okay, so here's the point. I was 21 years old. I'm 72 now. Your problem is going to be, how do I memorize something? My problem is I can't forget it. Now, it's not because seriously, it's not because I have a photographic memory. It's because I used a mnemonic system that's so engraved that into my memory that I will never forget it. I can tell you all the steps. So what I'm going to advise you to, especially if you're starting out, is go take a memory course. It's the one thing that will make your entire first 2 years easier. They're going to ask you to memorize crap. So rather than wasting your life doing it, learn a mnemonic memory system that will allow you to learn it efficiently and recall it perfectly. And it's worth its time over and over again. So just for the fun of it, he said alpha-ketoglutarate. A system that I used, every number has an image. So 1 is a little stool. 2 happens to be a swan. 3 is a 3-leaf clover. 4 is a table. 5 is a hand. 6 is a yo-yo. So now I'm swinging the yo-yo around and I hit a bull in the butt. You can't forget an image like that. So what did I do? I alpha-ketogglutarated it. So 8 is the 8 ball. So what happens when you scratch? The table sucks in the 8. So 8 is succinate. 9 looks just like a pipe. What's coming out? Smoke. Smoke is fumes. So 9 is fumarate. 10's a bat and a ball. Well, a bat's the same as a mallet. So that's malate. I know this sounds crazy, but do yourself a favor. Practical advice. Take a memory course. It'll save you untold hours, and your problem won't be remembering, it'll be forgetting.
Who would have thought? So Dr. Michelson, tell us what's one of the most recent patents you filed? What problems are you looking at today?
Well, I have an animal welfare foundation, and we actually, I guess, disrupted the industry that used to be microchipping pets. So the best way to get back your pet, whether it's cat or dog, if it's lost, is to have a microchip, because it's not like a collar that can be or on or off, or somebody lets your cat or dog out the back door by accident that you never would have let out and they're on the street. A microchip will get your pet back. So one of the problems with microchips is, unfortunately, they're about the size of a grain of rice. They're smooth. They can dislodge and move somewhere else in the body, so that when the animal gets scanned, you don't pick anything up, the animal gets destroyed. So one of the last things I did was a very simple tweak to that, where it's a high retention chip. Once it goes in place, it can never move. So it had a great practical value. It was very simple to me to do it, to design it, and it revolutionizes that industry.
So you are a renaissance man. I know in your philanthropic efforts, certainly IP education is a pillar, but also helping pets, and we can see your passion for that. So I think, first we want to thank you for taking your time to share with us, but I do want to turn it over to Jordan and thank Jordan for all his time organizing this panel and volunteering, in addition to memorizing the Krebs cycle that you've done. But Jordan, I'll turn it over to you for our last question or to wrap it up.
Perfect. Thank you, Mr. Dykeman. And thank you, Dr. Michelson. This has been extraordinary. I also wanted to take the time to also thank the Dr. Michelson Medical Research Foundation. They provided a very generous gold sponsorship. And, I did want to share that, because I was talking with Dr. Michelson earlier, that Dr. Michelson has kind of been part of my educational journey kind of indirectly. So as an undergraduate student, he actually made a very generous gift to my undergraduate college, USC, and they established what I thought was the most beautiful building, the Center for Convergent Bioscience. And he was also there during my graduation in 2017 when he was awarded an honorary degree. So Dr. Michelson, if there are no other questions, I just wanted to thank you on behalf of LMSA Northeast and for coming out here and just sharing your life experiences with us.
Well, it was my pleasure, and I wish you all the very, very best.
All right. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you so much.